Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Glad to see some new faces here today. I'm glad you can make it. So today we're going to expand a little bit on what we talked about last time. So last week we talked about how we can make ethical decisions as humanists, right? How do we develop a rational and ethical framework for ourselves and as a society and as a community that we can apply to make good decisions, quote unquote good. So today we take that idea of how we've built our decision-making stack from what we evolved with, right? The biological processes that we have that help us make decisions, how we then apply the front brain to override some of those inherent decisions and biases to then encompass more information, more data, so that we can make better decisions on behalf of ourselves and humanity, and then grow that into the concept of society, right? How do we get from making an individual decision framework consistent with everybody else's framework, or as best we can, right? How do we bring all those things together? So that's what we're going to kind of look at today. And then next week, we'll continue this conversation after we talk about what society is for, or what we can use it for. And then we'll figure out how we can capitalize on society by getting educated. What do we need as humans to be educated? So once we have our ethical framework, right, we can make consistent decisions for ourselves. We have to engage in the world of others, right? We're social creatures, so we have to figure out how do we engage with others. And that really relies on the concept of trust, right? If we're going out into the world and we're constantly on guard that someone else is going to take advantage of us or harm us, it's really difficult for us to engage with them in a way that allows us to build something greater, something more complex, that then allows us to further human meaning in the human story. So I was reading an article that was interesting. It's about blockchain, the blockchain technology, right, which is built on the idea of a public ledger that nobody can go back and change after the fact. So it's basically an infinite public record that anyone can look at and verify. And so this guy's actually writing about why blockchain isn't that useful, at least in the way the technology is built today. But so he'd also written a book about trust, and I liked the way that he built the concept of trust, and he has 4 different pieces of it. So the first 2 systems of trust are morals, right? So this idea that we have either a rational or, if you're religious, a sort of dictated set of common understood beliefs or understood rights and wrongs. So morals is the first one, reputation is the second one, right? And reputation is really like your adherence to morals in a way, right? Can you be trusted to be consistent in your application of your ethical framework? So those are your first 2 systems. The third is the institution, right? The third system is institutions and laws, right? We institutionalize morals, go into ethics. Ethics are the things that we jointly agree upon. Ethics then become enshrined in law because we've gotten to the point where it's become so complex that we can't remember all of the ethical agreements we have as a society. So we have to write them down somewhere. And so that third system then becomes the institution of law. So the fourth system is security systems. And these are our physical barriers or other things that we put into place to basically not have to worry about if someone will take advantage of something, that we basically take categories of things and remove them from our conscious worry by securing them. So those are the 4 ways that we build trust, or that we can enshrine trust in a society. So now that we have systems of trust, we can then, our society basically can emerge from that. Right, so we've started from ourselves. We have our morals and our ethics. We've institutionalized those in a way that other people can understand so that we can engage in a trustful relationship. And that allows us to engage in a society, something more complex than just the village or the tribe. So then what does that allow for? Right? So we're in a society now. What does it allow for? Well, it allows for things like specialization. Instead of having to worry about taking care of all of my own basic needs, I can outsource some of those things to people who are farmers, right? And I might be a potter, or I might be a blacksmith or a repair person or a philosopher and a teacher and a leader. And we get into these more and more specific roles that allow us to add to the complexity of society. So it allows for specialization, and it also allows for the exchange of value, right? Because we can trust that we can trade our skill either directly in the form of barter or through currency or whatever it is we've designated to hold value to carry, that we can engage in a transaction that we can trust in because we know the other person will reciprocate. So that's what society has allowed for us to do. Now, on the downside, of course, society has allowed for greater scales of war and atrocity, but at this point, it's hard to know, is that built into the system, or is it simply because of where we emerge from? That's a little bit of what we're going to examine today. So once we get into a society, we also have the rise of government, right? We have these more and more complex systems, and we need ways in which to understand them, ways in which we can represent our will as the individual, as a part of the community. And so what government does is it sort of codifies trust, right? Whether it's in laws, in standards, in culture. And so with a sort of libertarian classical libertarian definition of government provides some basic roles, right? So the collective defense, collective bargaining, enforcement of basic rights. And then this last one is a little bit more ephemeral, a little bit more squishy, and that's stability, right? So different governments have phrased it different ways, that it provides for the transaction of commerce, that it provides for the rule of law, enforcement of rule of law, but all of those things really get after providing stability for a society, for a culture. Now, how we go about providing that, how we go about providing stability, that's a whole different topic of consideration and argument, but that is one of the purposes of government. Now, one of the things that I would posit as something I think is important to consider is that the more we enshrine things into law in terms of what we should and should not do, the more rigid and less flexible our system becomes. Right, so we have arguments today about abortion or gay marriage or any number of things, immigration, and we try and dictate everything by law. And I forget which lawmaker said this recently, but law is a very blunt instrument, right? It tries to provide the right answer in all circumstances, but we know, due to reality, that almost no answer is right in every circumstance. So instead of maybe enshrining everything in law, we should figure out ways that the system, our system of government and the system of our society, incentivizes behaviors that are most advantageous rather than dictating what behaviors are and are not allowed. So it's just a little bit of an aside in terms of food for thought, that I think our system, as we look at it and refine it and continue to build it, should incentivize over dictating. So that's where we are, right? That's where we've come to. We've evolved as a species, and then we've built this complex society that has helped us to have relationships of trust, right? We're all in this room, and we don't think that anyone in here is going to murder us at this moment, right? We generally have that sense of trust, and that's actually a pretty amazing thing when you look at the rest of the creatures in the world. Most of them have a relationship based on, fear and power. And we do too, to an extent. We're still animals to a degree. But we have these overlying complex structures that allow us to engage in cooperative behavior instead of competitive behavior. But where do we go from here? Right? A lot of people, or some people out there would argue that the system is as good as it is, or the system is flawed, or humans are incapable of anything greater than what we currently have. And I don't know that I would agree with any of those. But I think what we need to do is question some of our fundamental assumptions. Can you open the door, please? We have to question some of our fundamental assumptions. Come on in.
We wandered around for like
No,
2 minutes.
sorry about that. Come on in. Welcome. Thank you. So thus far, we've been talking about society, how we got to have the society we have, and how we built from a moral framework to an ethical framework. Hey, Katie. To then having a rational and consistent way to engage in the world as individuals. So from there, we've started talking about then, how do we engage as a society? And then, of course, we talked a little bit about trust. How do we build trust? What are the systems of trust? And so then we talked a little bit about government, the role of government, having some basic functions. So collective defense, collective bargaining, enforcement of rights, and stability. And then the idea of we should try and incentivize behaviors that advance the human story as opposed to dictating the behaviors that are allowable or not, because that tends to be overly constrictive. So the question we ask now is, where do we go? How do we question some of our fundamental assumptions about government, about society, about ethics, and about how we engage with each other to build something maybe a little bit better? So the systems and the theories and the philosophies that we have today were developed in history, right? In times where we had significantly less understanding of the world and the universe around us. And they emerged from the systems that were built very slowly on top of the biological systems that we had. And we had to figure out ways to understand the world, how to understand trust, how to understand complexity with a much more rudimentary understanding of just how the world worked. So there were also significant amounts of scarcity in the world in the past. And we lacked knowledge, and we used mysticism to explain a lot of what we understood to be, quote unquote, true of the world at the time. So what would happen if we started over today and we wiped the slate clean and we started with the fundamental assumption that resources aren't scarce, right? There have been studies that have shown that we have enough food to feed everyone in the world. We have enough resources to provide shelter for everyone. So what would happen if we actually did that? What would happen if we started from providing for the basic needs of people? We're not talking about socialism or communism where everyone has the same thing, but providing the basic needs for everyone. What if everyone's basic needs were provided for? What would happen if you didn't spend all of your time in a given week trying to provide for your own basic needs? What would that free up your time and your mental capacity to then accomplish? For those of us who have a decent job or have made it through life and have retired, we realize that there's so much time and so much capacity for us to do great things. But if you're working a minimum wage job that then does not even provide enough for you and your family to subsist on, you're essentially trapped. You're essentially a slave to the system that exists today. So I think it's important for us to take a step back and look at what would happen if we rebuilt this system today. So the question I would ask to frame your mind is, think about the Renaissance, the period of the Renaissance, and the scientific advancement that occurred during that period of time. Who were the people who were able to advance that scientific thought? Who was it? So people in church, monasteries, also the wealthy children of aristocrats, people who did not have a need to provide for themselves. They were provided for by whatever system it was that took care of them. And because they had the time free, they spent their time thinking about the greater questions of the world. Why do apples fall? Why do the stars move the way they do? And so if we apply that to today, with the billions of people we have, imagine if, a little bit rosy pictured, but imagine if those people spent their time thinking about solving problems. How much human capacity for learning and development are we wasting because we have an inefficient method of distributing resources to care for those basic needs. When we think about it like that, to me, it's sort of a light bulb moment that there's so much capacity out there. It's like as if you used a computer, right? And you took 95% of its computing capacity and just had it monitoring, a silly detector of some kind, or just monitoring its power source, and spent 95% of its time just monitoring its power source. When it doesn't really need to do that, the power source is there, it's available. And if instead we shift those resources over to thinking about solving problems, we'd get them solved quite a bit more quickly. And it's incredible to me because when you look at a lot of the people that we hold up as scions of learning and accomplishment today, it's a lot of people who have come from places of deprivation and they figured out something, right? Some technology, some idea, and brought it to the Western world, and we're like, wow, that's a fantastic idea. But we always think that, oh, well, that person must have been a genius. They must have been special. The Bill Gateses, the Mark Zuckerbergs, and the Elon Musks. They were special. There's something different about them. I don't think that's the case. Yeah, they might have had some unique combination of circumstances and experience and intelligence, but I think humans are actually a lot more capable than we consider them to be, especially if we give them the opportunity to show it. So I think if we rethought our system and figured out how to make it a little bit more efficient, again, not providing the same for everyone, because I think history has shown that if we try and do that, again, law is a blunt instrument, and I think if we try and make everything equal for everyone, it in fact becomes less equal because of the capability for corruption in the system. But if we at least give everybody enough, they can then use their capacity to do something better. So I really think that's how we can unlock human potential through society. Now, I don't know what the specifics of that are. I'm not going to get up here and say, I have the answer. This is the answer. Go forth and make it so. But I think it's important to question the fundamental assumptions that our system is the best, and that it couldn't be better, and that it shouldn't be better. So I want to hit on this idea of post-scarcity again. Like I said, there are studies out there that show that we could feed and house everyone in the world. And so I would encourage you to go out there and do the research for yourself. Go just take a look at it. How does that change the math in your head? Because I think the way our capitalistic system is designed today is, I would call it rent-seeking capitalism. Our goal as an individual is to interject ourselves between people and their money and glean as much of it for ourselves as we can, because we believe the world is scarce and we have to provide for ourselves and our family at all costs, which in the short term is a very reasonable assumption or a very reasonable directive to have, right? I know I would do anything for my kids. If I didn't have the means to provide for them, I would steal and cheat and lie. But if we realize we don't actually have to do that, and we don't have to try and take value from others for ourselves, well, maybe that would change how we engage in capitalism. I think it would move it from a rent-seeking capitalism to maybe more of a investment-based capitalism. And I don't mean that in terms of stock markets. I mean investing in human capital, investing in society, investing in things that are sustainable on the longer term. I think it would also drive us a little bit past consumerism, the idea that we need to take more and more stuff in, right? Get the new thing, because again, our brains are wired to think everything is scarce, because evolutionarily, that's how we grew up. There was only so much food. You look at the obesity epidemic today. Our bodies aren't designed to handle the amount of abundance that we have. And so we have to come up with new systems to figure out how to exist in this world. And then I think that then can drive, a little bit of environmentalism, because if we don't have to consume as much, we don't use as much. It's less energy generated, less waste generated, et cetera. So I think there's a trickle up effect, I would say, in terms of building human society. when we can think about how we can invest our time and our resources and our capital into the long term versus the short term. But that idea of post-scarcity, I think, is important because it completely reorients our primitive brain. So I think what you build at that point is a human economy. An economy built around progressing humanity forward. And so what would that look like? Well, so some ideas that I had thought of, and again, these are not the answer, these are just visions of what something might look like, is you might have fully self-sufficient small communities, basically redundant communities, that can provide for themselves on a smaller scale. Because when you think about the technology we have today, you don't need a huge power plant miles away when you can have wind and solar power, as long as you have the storage capacity to use it right there. And if you don't need huge amounts of infrastructure to get things to and from places, that reduces the amount of roads you need, which then allows for smaller walkable communities, which then allows more land in the nearby area that you could actually use to provide most of your own food. And especially with the high-tech ability we have to grow food and use greenhouses and monitoring capabilities and soil moisture content monitoring. I mean, the productivity that we have today out of a hectare of land is absolutely incredible compared with 100 or 200 or 500 years ago. And so what if we rethought these communities to be little redundant places that are still interconnected with the rest of the world, but self-sufficient? More redundant when it comes to maybe disease or calamity or catastrophe. I was reading an article not too long ago that an EMP detonated over the United States would wipe out something like 90% of the population because we're so reliant on the infrastructure that we have to move things over great distances. And people have lost the skill to provide for themselves through basic subsistence. And you could get things like food and water, shelter, power, and even basic manufacturing with 3D printing today, all at a local level. And so you would provide for your own basic needs. And then, of course, you also need that aspect of community, that connection. And I think in going this direction, we would regain some of that. Today, we live in the idea of every house is your castle, right? Every man's castle. And we're separated from ourselves, or separated from our neighbors by not just walls, but by Netflix and social media. And not that those things are necessarily bad, but that we oftentimes misuse them and have them replace that genuine human connection that we have in this room today, just by being here and being present. And so how do we get there? How do we get from today's society that's so fractious and divisive to this idea where we can be collaborative and invest in the future? Well, obviously, we thought the church was an important step in that direction. Having a humanist way to look at how do we build community, and even that we should build community in the first place. And then, of course, education. I saw a great quote the other day, I think posted on one of the Facebook pages. And I think it was about anti-vaccine ideas, is people learn just enough science to be dangerous, basically. Just enough science to justify their position, but not enough science to then question their fundamental assumptions. To me, one of the greatest downfalls in our society today is our lack of investment in education. And I don't mean the amount of money we put in it. We put tons of money into education. But the investment in the quality of education. And we're going to talk a lot more about that next week. It's a topic of passion for me, because to me, that is the ultimate investment in humanity. The most valuable thing we have is up here, not what's in our pocket or in our bank. And the more we invest in each other, in our capacity for learning and critical thinking, the better off humanity will be. The better able we will be to solve the problems of the future. And then generally investing in the common good. So like I said, an investment-based capitalism, where we invest in the long-term return on investment. And so again, that's things like education, infrastructure, and smart infrastructure. And I don't necessarily mean technologically smart, though that's a piece of it. but infrastructure that is beneficial both to humanity and to the environment that sustains us. And then in programs of stability. Now, I had a great conversation with someone earlier this week about the welfare system. And he's fundamentally or morally opposed to taking money from some person and giving it to another person. And I can understand where that comes from, because I think that comes from the idea of scarcity. If resources are scarce and I've worked hard for my resources, why should I have to give it to somebody else? And I think that's a fair conclusion based on that assumption of scarcity. When I look at it, though, and I've been to a fair amount of places that are highly unstable, Afghanistan being one of them, I ask myself, well, what's the return on investment for my payment? So let's say it's my taxes. Let's say, just call it $1,000. $1,000 out of my taxes every year go directly to someone else. What does that get me? Well, if it gets me lower crime, and if it gets me a more stable family upbringing for that person's children, and if it gets me a little bit of education for them, that then allows them to provide a life for their family as they grow up, that's actually a pretty good return on investment for me. Because for me to be able to spend the rest of my money that I got to keep after taxes, I need a stable society, a stable economy. I want to live in a place where there's low crime, where there are good educational districts, where there are events and amenities, people can walk the neighborhoods and feel safe. Those are all, intangible benefits that I gain that I can't necessarily put a monetary cost on, but that are provided by the idea of stability. Now, we can argue all day about the efficiency of the welfare system and if it incentivizes the right behaviors, right? One particular point is, for a lot of people, coming off of welfare is less advantageous than staying on it, because there's this weird gap in between when they start to make enough money, they actually lose their benefits, which means they end up making less than they would have made on welfare, right? So maybe we need to tune our system to be a little bit more smart in transitioning people in that direction, or incentivizing education so they can jump over that gap into a job that then allows them to provide for themselves. But that's the last piece I wanted to make, or last point I wanted to make about providing, or society providing stability, is that we do need to account for the fact that sometimes people will fail in life, or circumstances will cause them to fail or contribute to failure. We all have responsibility to make decisions and make our lives better. But when you are in a circumstance that is so desperate that your choices are limited, or even if they seem limited, and we've talked in the past about perception being reality, well, then I think it will be a little bit hubristic of us to cast the first stone, to use a biblical reference. Right? I grew up in somewhat hard circumstances, but not as hard as circumstances I've seen for others. And yes, I made decisions that allowed me to provide a life for my family. Other people didn't have that path available to them. And so if we want to live in a stable society where we're able to reap the benefits of our hard work, then I think we need to provide that basic stability for others. And again, we can argue about the specifics, but I don't think we can argue about that foundational piece. I think otherwise we end up with a French Revolution type scenario where we have people who are, I don't want to say righteously, but justifiably violent because they can't provide for themselves given the system they're in. And when you look at society today, there are parallels to the period before the French Revolution. Huge amounts of economic disparity, enormous amounts of political division, haves and have-nots. And if we don't want to go that path, I think we need to fundamentally rethink how we're going about society and stability. So thank you for coming today. Next week, we're going to continue this conversation on unlocking human potential again with education. It's something, again, that I'm very passionate about because I do think it is the key investment that we make in each other. So thank you again for your time. For those of you at home, as we do every week, think of something that you were grateful for in the past week and think of something you're looking forward to in the week to come. Keep that in your mind. Keep that perspective that there's always some good in the world that we can rely on, and then we use that as a foundation to move ourselves forward, move our communities forward, and make the world a better place. Thank you very much. Have a great week.